Thank you for coming out tonight on such a dark and stormy night. First time we've had any rain in a week or so, so it's good to see. Just so you know, this evening is being recorded and will be shown on the town website by tomorrow and also on the local TV channel 18. So tell your friends. We have a great program tonight with Rich Delaney, but first I'd like to give you a little background on how this evening has come about. I'm Roberta Longley, and I am the chair of the Eastham Climate Action Committee. It's a town committee that was created about a little over a year ago. And our primary charge is to advise the select board and to communicate with residents regarding ways to best implement the town's commitment to reducing our carbon footprint and in finding ways to reduce our vulnerability to the potential consequences of climate change. And one way of doing that is to provide education and to engage the community. And hopefully that is what we will do this evening. Tonight's the first of a three-part series that's going to be held at the library relating to climate action, meaning what we as individuals and our community can do, how we can act towards in the fight for regarding to climate change. But before I introduce Rick, I'd like first to introduce our town manager, Jackie Beebe, who would like to say a few words. Can you help me welcome Jackie?
Thank you, Roberta, and it's very exciting to have a climate action committee finally in the town and having it reinforce the select board's clear directive and mission and acceptance of the fact that we have a climate change emergency and we want to do something about it as Eastham residents, as a town, as global citizens, right? So welcome, Rich. And I just wanted to, I sat down today and just made a brief list of some of the things that Eastham has done already and is exploring, because it is, as Roberta said, a twofold issue for us. We're trying to reduce our carbon footprint, and I think we have been slow at that piece of it, but we're also trying to increase our resiliency as a coastal community to clear climate change impacts, right? So from our municipal vulnerability preparedness program, which Eastham participated in, to about $700,000 in grants with the 4 towns of the Outer Cape to look at coastal erosion and erosion mitigation and sand management in general, and how the 4 towns can work together to coordinate the management of that so that we don't inadvertently create new problems when we're trying to solve obvious erosion problems. The low-lying roads study program, replacing our inspectional vehicles with electric cars. We have also 3 large solar arrays, and we're trying to increase those as we go as well. So welcome, Rich, and thank you to the Climate Action Committee.
Thank you, Jackie. That's great. Yes, we have made progress, but of course there is much to do. We will have an opportunity to talk about that next month, actually. I want to remind you that, as I said, this is the first of the series. On Tuesday, October 25th, Kristen Andrews, who's from the APCC, the Association to Protect Cape Cod, she'll be talking about climate-conscious landscaping, giving us an idea of what we personally can do on our property to make our plants and our environment more biodiverse, reduce our carbon footprint, and adapt to extreme weather like drought and deluge. On Thursday, November 3rd, we will have a session here called Meet Your Town Climate Action Committee. And this is your opportunity to find out what we've been doing over the past year and also share with us, have an opportunity to share and have discussion with us as to what you feel is important regarding climate action. So there's more information in the back, some flyers if you want to take them. Also, there is a sheet for email addresses. If you're interested in hearing from us, please add your name and email address, and we promise we will not overburden you with communication, but every now and then you may want to hear from us, so please sign up. Okay. Our honored guest tonight is Rich Delaney, who serves as the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. That is quite a mouthful, but it is an important nonprofit here on the Cape that he helped found in 2016. Rich is well known for his environmental work over a number of decades, including 14 years as the president and CEO of the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, where he continues to serve as a part-time senior advisor and the interim director of the Marine Policy Department. Previously, Rich founded the Urban Harbors Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He also served as Assistant Secretary of Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts and was national chair of the Coastal States Organization in Washington, D.C. Rich has consulted to governments in over 20 countries regarding climate change and coastal and ocean management, and has participated in international conferences such as the Global Ocean Forum, the Rio 20 events in Rio de Janeiro, the Paris Climate Conference in 2016, and the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. Rich plans to speak for about 40 minutes. Is that about right? And then we've saved some time for your questions and discussion. So can you please help me welcome Rich Delaney?
Thank you. Well, it's great to be back in Eastham, and thank you for that introduction. My first committee in that whole long list that you just described, Roberta, actually started with my very first assignment when the Eastham Board of Selectmen, I think Phil Deschamps was the board chair, appointed me to the recycling committee in Eastham. And our committee designed a few concrete bins, just opened like little concrete walls, three-sided, where Easthamers started putting plastic and glass and tin cans back in the 70s. And that was kind of the beginning. So needless to say, I lived here for a while. We raised our two boys right down the street in just on Lombard Lane. But it's great to be back here, and congratulations, Jackie and Roberta and everyone. Half of the recommendations I'm going to make in my presentation, Eastham's already doing, so keep it up. This is terrific. But I think I'll just plunge right into this. I do want to save time for a Q&A, because I think most often that's the most beneficial part for all of us. So here's what I'm going to talk a little bit about is this whole idea of climate change and action starting at the international level, but quickly coming down to national and down to where I think the real action happens. It's right here locally. You know, that expression, think globally, act locally, I still believe in that. I think that's where it really, where we have to put a lot of our effort. And that's where the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative is trying to be helpful. We're a coalition of wide cross-section of business, environmental, public, and nonprofit groups. The whole idea was that, as I've said to many people, this is not an environmental problem, it's not a political problem, it's not a social, it's everybody's problem. And every sector has to come to the table with some actions to help us solve this problem. And that's why there's a great cross-section of people serving on the board of directors. And our mission is pretty simple, as Jackie and Roberta said. How do we reduce our climate change footprint, our carbon footprint? How do we reduce how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere? And now, at the same time, prepare for the changes that have already been put in motion, unfortunately. We're not going to be able to resolve this thing totally. It's not going to go away. We can slow the rate of climate warming, but there is enough CO2 up there, and the temperature is going to warm in the future enough so we have some issues to deal with. How do we do our work? We try to convene people. For example, on October 28th, we'll be convening people virtually for our 5th Net Zero Conference. I'll tell you more about that at the end. I hope you'll join us. We do a lot of communication, like tonight we're communicating with each other. We have a great website. We have a newsletter, an action newsletter that comes out every couple of weeks. We collaborate, and not just, as I said earlier, traditionally with other environmentalists or other conservation groups, but with all kinds of people from every sector. And we advocate. We encourage people to get out and raise their hands at town meeting, to form groups, to do what you're doing here in Eastham, because we need to activate ourselves and everybody we can possibly do to help solve this issue. I want to talk just for a few minutes about the science, because action on dealing with climate change has been delayed, unfortunately, for decades by this whole idea that it wasn't a real issue. And I won't talk a lot about it, but the climate deniers and a lot of misinformation, a lot of it propagated by the fossil fuel company deliberately, has slowed action on this issue. But there's no doubt that it's settled. And I'll just show you, if you want to boil down all of the charts and sciences to something that's really easy, it's a hockey stick. And I've always played hockey all my life. I still actually get out with the old timers every once in a while down in Orleans. So it's a special way for me to remember these things. But no matter what you're measuring and trying to explain in the trend, if you're talking about how much the surface of the ocean has warmed, if you want to describe how the Earth has warmed, or how much carbon dioxide, almost any of those metrics basically have remained steady for about 2,000 years until 1850s, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's when human beings started burning coal and other fossil fuels. And that's where the line goes right off the chart in terms of how much carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere. And you can see well, sorry, wrong button. Trying to get this little arrow to work here. Yep, there it is. So you can see there is variation right here. Oh, I'm just going to you can see on that hockey stick, there are, on the blue lines, peaks and valleys. So the deniers would say, well, it got really, really cold, 1,500 years ago. I got really hot 1,000 years ago. Yes, it did. There are variations, but when you look at the trend, it really didn't change until 1850. And those red dots, that data comes not from modeling ice cores or tree rings. It's real data from thermometers, good old-fashioned thermometers. So we're measuring the change, and we can see how it's happening dramatically. And by the way, this chart only goes up to 2000. The next 22 years, that red line continues to escalate straight up into the air. So it's no doubt things are changing. And for better or for worse, probably for worse in the long run, we are here on Cape Cod and in New England, adjacent to a section of the ocean that is warming faster than any other part of the ocean, probably except the Arctic Ocean. Just because of a confluence of currents and bathymetry and other reasons, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster, which exacerbates all of the climate impacts. The good news is things have begun to turn around finally after 30 or 40 years of denying the problem or delaying action. And it really kicked off internationally in 2015 at the Paris Climate Accord, when 196 presidents and prime ministers came together and actually agreed on about a 27-page document. Almost every single word was debated during that conference. It was really a process and a miracle that it happened. But one of the reasons it happened is because the previous 20 times, or 20 years, when there attempted to be an agreement on a climate accord, the method for doing it was mandatory treaties or mandatory actions on other nations. In Paris in 2015, they changed the approach and said, let's let each country make a voluntary commitment. And all of 196 did. It was a lot easier politically back home. So that's how we finally got to an agreement. And one of the other important outcomes of that Paris Agreement was that the 196 leaders of the world's countries agreed on a target that they would try to reach. And the degree, and what they attempted to reach, what they agreed on, was to not let the average temperature of the Earth warm more than 2 degrees Celsius than it was back in 1850, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Try this one more time. So, okay, so the baseline is 1850. Let's not let the world warm more than 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now, there were some other people, other countries in Paris, about 100 of them, which are mostly island nations or low-lying areas in the Southeast Asia. They said, listen, 1.5 has to be our target because the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees may be life or death for our country. We may be submerged, and that's true. It's a big difference. So in the end, the agreement was, let's have an agreement, a target of 2 degrees Celsius, but aim for 1.5. Right now, if we don't do anything and we do business as usual, as the world's people, we'll end up at 3.6, 3.5, which is about 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. That's huge. That's devastating. All right? So that's the target. And since 2016, every year, the climate leaders, presidents or at least their deputies, come back together to make sure that we're staying on track. Unfortunately, we're not quite staying on track. And one more point on this slide. Even those pledges, those volunteer pledges, even if they were all fulfilled, it still would only come up at 3 degrees. We'd stop it at 3 degrees. So when the leaders come back this year, and the meeting's going to be in Egypt next month in November, they're going to have to up the ante and make even stronger promises. And why is that 1.5 degrees Celsius really important, even more than the 2 degrees? Well, there are things called tipping points. This is a little bit more technical, but let me just jump ahead one slide. You can think of a tipping point in anything, not just science, but it's basically where a process or a system is changing and it gets to the point where it cannot be reversed, right? Ernest Hemingway said it probably the best down here in the bottom. Change happens very slowly, and then it happens all at once. So the modeling that has been done by the United Nations scientists have warned us that there actually are a few tipping points that the models show could happen fairly soon. And that is the Greenland ice sheet. If we continue as business as usual and the warming continues and gets beyond 1.5, could start to slide off, melt and slide off and produce a lot more fresh water coming into the ocean. Same with the West Antarctica ice sheet. The coral reefs could die off in huge numbers. You know they're already dying off because of ocean acidification. And so those are tipping points that are the most frightening results of the scientific models. They're not guaranteed. They're models. They're predictions. But to me, they say, this is why we have to take urgent action. We have no room to wait, no leeway anymore. If that Greenland ice sheet collapses, just as an example, I don't think I have, no, I'll go back. I'll just take a minute on this one because it really is kind of interesting. Off the east coast of the United States, there is a circulatory pattern of water. The Gulf Stream comes up bringing warm water from the Caribbean on the surface, gets all the way up to the Labrador area and cools. Meanwhile, the colder water from the Labrador current that's coming south is running underneath the Gulf Stream. So you basically have warm water on the surface coming up from the Caribbean, colder water from Labrador coming down. And it's been a nice balance for eons. It brings warm water up for our climate, takes cold water down, and everything's been balanced. If that Greenland ice sheet starts to melt, which it's doing already, but it melts at a faster rate, it will put more fresh water into the northern hemisphere, which will slow down the warm water coming up from the Caribbean. That will have all kinds of ramifications on our weather. It will impact Europe because that Gulf Stream goes by our coast and then heads over to Europe. If you've been fortunate enough to be in England or Ireland, you see palm trees on the southwest coast of those countries. That's because of the Gulf Stream current bringing the warm water all the way across the Atlantic. All that will change with unforeseen devastating impacts. That's a tipping point. That's why we have to act immediately. So you know about the impacts on Cape Cod probably as well as most people do. You guys certainly seem to be up to speed on this, but I think maybe my slides are out of place. The impacts that we know about that are happening and have been projected by the United Nations scientists. And this is a panel, you may have read about the IPCC panel. It's the International Panel or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's about 2,000 scientists from countries around the world who've looked at these issues and have been making predictions and reports for several years now, actually almost 20 years. And their most recent report came out in just this past September, and it said, guys, it's even worse than we've been predicting in our previous 5 reports. And as you have seen, wildfires, heat waves, ice sheets melting, I was just talking about that, all of that is intensifying because we aren't really taking the action other than those pledges the government's made. So we have to really speed this up, was the message from the most recent report. More warming will make things even worse. That's that whole thing about a tipping point. It sort of builds on itself. So extreme temperature, extreme weather events and temperatures will become commonplace instead of occasional, rare weather things that we think are just happening once every 500 years or once every 100 years. They'll be happening with regularity, which puts most of the life on the planet at some degree of risk. If the world warms by more than that 1.5 degrees Celsius, extreme weather events will happen 4 times more likely. And we've seen that here in Cape Cod even this summer. So it's serious business. I don't need to tell you that. It's scary business sometimes, but it's the reality we have to face as a people. Some of the physical impacts that are pretty clear, we felt them here this summer, increased temperatures. All right, we're already seeing that. Severe storms, storm frequency will happen, all right, more often or less often, but more intense. Ocean acidification is one that a lot of people don't really hear about or understand, and I'll take a minute on that one. When you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's the carbon dioxide is the waste product of burning fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is, as you remember your chemistry class, CO2, the elemental substance, carbon and 2 molecules of oxygen. When the atmosphere has too much, more than it can assimilate, the extra CO2 precipitates out and much of it falls in the ocean. Over hundreds of years, the ocean has been able to absorb some of that naturally, but its ability to absorb it has reached its capacity. So now when you have a CO2 molecule hit the ocean and it combines with another molecule of oxygen, you now have CO3. CO3 is carbonic acid. That's what's happening to our ocean. So as the acidity becomes worse in the ocean, you can imagine shells of lobster begin to change, coral reefs get deteriorated, food chain changes happen, the seafood web that supports all of the rest of the commercial fish and others changes. It's one that we need to pay a lot more attention to and study, because that may be one of the most devastating impacts we have. And you've seen the others. Shifting habitats down at the bottom. We are experiencing that, and you know that if any of you are from fishing families, our fishermen have said, wait a minute, the codfish and the lobsters aren't right out there in George's Bank where we used to catch them. Yeah, that's because we have moved north and out to deeper water to get with the cold, stay in their cold habitat. And the changing ocean currents, I've been talking about that already. Some of the non-physical but important impacts from climate change are what it's going to cost us. Building damage alone, estimated in a very good report produced by the Cape Cod Commission called Economic Impacts of Climate Change, projects $13 to $17 billion worth of damage here on the Cape over the years because of increased storms and flooding and erosion. That, of course, reduces the value of property. One interesting thought on that reduction of value of property, and we've seen this happen in a couple towns already. Falmouth is one of them I can think of. The more expensive, more highly taxed waterfront properties, right? And that tax supports the overall budget of the town. Those properties are being devalued because they're facing erosion or because the houses are in imminent danger of falling in. So their tax rate goes down, their tax assessment goes down. Those are usually people who can afford a waterfront house. Their tax rate goes down, or their tax assessment, not rate, goes down, or amount of tax they pay. But the tax burden for the town stays the same. So that extra burden gets shifted to the other members of the community who don't live on the coastline. So you get an equity issue right away, a fairness issue. These are just the little nuances about climate change that people don't think of right away. But it's pretty clear. Flood insurance, if it's even available, I don't know about you guys, but when we lived in Orleans, our insurance company just outright canceled our flood insurance, and we're nowhere near the water. So things are happening like that. You mentioned the road damage and the low-lying roads mentioned by Jackie. That's an important thing. That's going to cause all kinds of havoc as sea level rises. So the important stuff is, what can we do? I mean, I don't need to scare you anymore, and I don't mean to. And that's not the message I'm bringing tonight, because I'm ever the optimist, and I think we have to be. But unless we understand the problem and know what the impacts are, we can't fashion actions to mitigate those or to address those. So when we talk about towns, you know this well, there are a lot of dimensions to a town. Yes, it's your elected officials, but there are a number of appointed boards and committees. Boy, the health boards, as you might know, have a lot of power to act. They can really do a lot of good things if you have a creative group of people on your Board of Health. Conservation commissions obviously have a lot of power. Town managers, Jackie and her team, all are people who are part of the solution in a town. And the fact that the people that you organize as citizens, like Roberta has done with some of the rest of you as a climate action group or a CAN or a climate action committee, that's important. That's where the action begins, right there with the people. And boards can do lots of things. Jackie again mentioned, I believe or Roberta did, the emergency declaration that you guys adopted. 14 to 15 towns in Cape Cod, people at town meetings, in most of the towns, passed that. They said, we are declaring a climate emergency, it's like 2 or 3 years ago, and we want our elected officials and our boards and our committees to act accordingly. So that's kind of how policy gets started. But there are so many ways where that policy can be implemented: buying electric vehicles, climate smart lighting, any number of things. Every town building. I live in Orleans, and I'll tell you, we're embarrassed in Orleans. We built 3 public buildings in the last 10 years, not one solar panel on the roof. I mean, that was a huge missed opportunity. The Orleans Can group is starting to say, wait a minute, let's go back and revisit that. Maybe we can retrofit it. We're about to build a new school, I think, Nauset Regional High School. I hope we're not missing the opportunity there to make that energy efficient, renewable energy, another one, because that's where you make a difference. So you can see the rest. I'm not going to go through those bullet by bullet, but towns working together across the different departments with citizens actively involved in pushing the climate actions as a priority are really important. And how do you do that with, what some of the more specific things like regulations? And this is not, I mentioned at the international level, there was finally agreement in Paris because it was a voluntary set of commitments. That's fine, but I also showed you it's coming up a little bit short. Sometimes you really need to take that extra step and have a regulation or a mandate or a law that sets the standard. So don't, I think that's the step, that's the point we're at in many areas. We have to advocate for strong legislation, strong regulation, and strong action, even if it means mandatory actions. The climate action groups are, again, very important. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's where it all begins. They can advocate for local politicians, town departments to do their work. They can identify risks that the town faces from climate change, vulnerable buildings, infrastructure, threatened natural resources. And they can engage people to get out and vote. I'll say it again later in this presentation, but the most important thing each one of us can do as an individual is to vote in every election, local, state, national. We need a massive climate vote in every level of voting going forward, starting in a couple weeks in November. That's how we're going to change the political will to take action. And I'm getting a little bit repetitive. I'm sorry, I'll move through this, but you know what it means. You got to show up. You got to speak up. You got to step up. It's not enough just to raise your hand anymore and say, yeah, I'm concerned about climate. Yeah, I think we need some action. That's good. That's a first step. But then you have to show up, you have to speak up, and you have to make things happen. So that's the local towns. But what else can we do to fight? Well, there are solutions, and people with knowledge can help unlocking some of the vast opportunities that we have in front of us. We must all take proactive measures to get there, though, and that includes not only people, but business, government, all sectors. That's how we're going to do this. And one thing to recognize is we all have a carbon footprint. Right? That means what you do in your day-to-day life produces carbon dioxide. Right? So if you study this chart a little bit, you'll see in the United States, our carbon footprint, 14.95, almost 15 tons of carbon dioxide is produced by each one of us on an annual basis. All right? That's a lot. Canada is next, South Korea, Russia. So when people say, wait a minute, we don't have to take action because China is producing a lot more carbon dioxide and India is producing a lot more carbon dioxide than the United States, we're not going to do anything until they get their act together. Well, that's a cop-out. They are in terms of raw numbers because they have so many more people. But in terms of individual actions, we are the biggest culprit. We as individuals in the United States are the people that produce more per capita because of our lifestyle, our behavior, our things. And by the way, that's reduced a little bit because we also benefit from strong environmental regulations. We've put in place, thankfully, air pollution regulations and other laws that have kept that number down from what it could be, but it's still significant. So when people say, what can I do as an individual? I'll say, yeah, take any number of actions to make your 14 tons 13 tons next year, or 12 tons, all the way down the line. And how do you do that? Well, your house is one big source. That nice chart that has been produced out there as you walk in the door said our buildings on Cape Cod, our response buildings and our offices and our stores, the built environment produces about 35% of Cape Cod's greenhouse gases. Right? So there's a place to start. Make sure you have solar panels on your roof if you can. Turning that thermostat down, or for both your air conditioning and your heating. This says a degree or two. We could go a little bit further. By the way, we didn't have air conditioning until about the 1920s. Right? I know most of us probably didn't grow up with it. It wasn't even a thing until a guy named Carrier invented his air conditioner. You can see that's a famous name for air conditioners. If you read about his life, he convinced everybody in the United States that we have to be able to live year-round in a range of temperature between 68 and 72 degrees. He said, and therefore, you need my air conditioner when it gets hotter than 72 degrees. An ingenious marketer that sold air conditioners, and now everyone expects it. But prior to that, our grandparents and other people didn't think twice about fluctuations in temperature. The seasons change. Put another sweater on, take it off. But James Carrier changed that for worse, because air conditioners are not the most energy efficient appliances. So the good news here is, how can you do it yourself? Well, there are a lot of things in your home, and if you don't know them all yourself, we've got an absolutely unbelievable resource here on Cape Cod called the Cape Light Compact. And you can look it up, or you can jot down that number. They will send out a team of engineers to your home free of charge. They will go through and do an assessment and show you endless ways where you can save your energy costs and reduce CO2. And they'll do it for free. And even then, if you implement what their recommendations are, sometimes as much as 75% of that cost is picked up by the Cape Light Compact, which actually is your money. Because if you look at your electric bill, there's a little item down the bottom, a couple cents per kilowatt hour, that goes into a pool of funds that they administer that pays for this stuff. So use your money that they're holding to help make your homes more energy efficient, reducing greenhouse gases, helping save the planet, and by the way, helps your pocketbook, your wallet too, right? Great service here in the Cape. Transportation, that's our other big one. 55% of all of Cape Cod's greenhouse gases come from our cars. And it was raining tonight, so I didn't take the time to walk through the parking lot. I usually count how many hybrid or electric cars are out there in the audience so I can embarrass ourselves. But I'm sure a lot of you have a good car out there. And I noticed the 2 charging stations to the library. Good work. But we need to all be driving an electric vehicle in the next car you buy. So put it on your list, start working toward it. The prices are coming down dramatically. And you've probably seen the major manufacturers of automobiles have made the big jump already. Every one of them have committed to producing only electric vehicles by 2030, 8 years from now, or 2035. You won't be able to buy a diesel or a gas-driven car. So that's great news that the business community is doing a leadership role there, but let's make sure that happens by providing the market and buying those cars, because that's the big thing on the Cape. We also can control a lot of where the money goes, right? So if you think about investments propel business decisions. a lot of investments have been going, whether it's your pension fund or your own investment fund, to help support and shore up that fossil fuel industry. Yes, they've been making money to give back to you, but that's at the cost of the planet. One thing that startled me when I was in Paris, we found out that when you put together all countries in the world together subsidize the fossil fuel industries to the tune of $500 billion a year. So that's taxpayer money. In the United States, it's about 30 billion of your money, our money, taken by our Congress, gets handed over free of charge to the fossil fuel industry. And you can imagine what they do with that. Besides all the profits they're making at the gas pump already, they use that to buy influence back with that same congressional body. They've got a stranglehold on it, and that has to be broken. You can break some of it by directing your own investments and your pension fund investments away from the fossil fuel industry to support green industry, wind turbines and solar panels. That's where a real change is going to happen. And if you send that signal to the market, they will respond. Simple things, planting trees. A couple of the countries who signed the Paris Agreement made commitments to pass new laws. Some of them made commitments to buy electric vehicles. Several of the countries made commitments to plant millions of trees. And in fact, that is a legitimate thing, because trees, we can actually calculate how much carbon dioxide trees will take out of the atmosphere. So join that group when you have an opportunity to. It's absolutely critical. Don't waste food. Sounds like, what's it got to do with climate change? Well, about 1 billion tons of food is wasted a year, and about 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gases are created in producing that food that's wasted. So there's a chance to reduce the amount of the percentage of greenhouse gases right off the bat, besides just the ethical issue of not wasting food. Make compost out of it, and so forth and so on. And along the same lines, buy locally. That saves a lot of greenhouse gases. I bought some blueberries recently, and I looked at the label. They were grown on Easter Island. Easter Island, I've been, Karen and my wife and I've been to Easter Island. I'm very fortunate. That's where they have the big moais, the huge statues that were mysteriously built or transported there, by Polynesian populations. Why am I eating in Orleans blueberries that were grown in Easter Island? It just doesn't make sense. But imagine the carbon footprint of that decision, the amount of gas and fuel to fly them here. Not only the plastic that's a fossil fuel derivative that they were packaged in. So that's a dramatic example, but our whole food system is not very sustainable, and we can change that by buying local, buying sustainable, buying seasonal food, and I probably shouldn't really be eating blueberries in January, because they're a summer plant, right? Tweak your diet. This is another interesting one. People eat a fair amount of meat in this country. Meat is one of the products that, to produce meat, it takes about 60% of the agricultural land just to raise the livestock. Right? And livestock alone, cows, are another source of, as you probably know, greenhouse gases through flatulation and even belching. That sounds silly, but it's actually, when you have millions and millions of cows, that can add up. So just by reducing meat consumption across the country by a day a week, we could actually reduce our CO2 from that sector by 15%. Right? And you probably know this story too, but the Amazon jungle is famous because it's such a lush, productive environment, and those plants sequester or take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. A great service for the whole globe in reducing climate change. You know, I think, that the Amazon jungle is being cut down. The Brazilian president is just encouraging that. He's feeding it. He's fueling it. Millions of acres every year are getting cut. Why? A lot of it is getting cut down to convert to grazing land to produce cows, cattle, that become meat that gets sent back to the United States to be sold at our hamburger joints. All right? Stop eating meat. Vegans have a good argument. You don't have to go total vegan, but just give it up a little bit and you help the cause. And there, I mentioned this already, buy locally, shop locally. 64% fewer emissions can be achieved by farming conventionally and by looking at protecting the biodiversity of those farms. And then act locally, and that's what we've been talking about all night. So I'm going to try to wrap this up so we can get to a few minutes of Q&A. Join the groups. You've got a great group already started here. The Climate Action Network is one that the Climate Collaborative is trying to encourage so that we can share lessons learned. There are about 5 or 6 towns, yours included, that now have active, what we call climate action networks, but it's like a climate action committee. And we're trying to encourage each town to share lessons learned, so you can do that through our third Thursday meetings. You can get our newsletter, capecodclimate.org/newsletter, and you can get more information from our website. So these are all some of the things you can do that the collaborative is trying to support, and we're not the only ones. We're just trying to help do our piece to encourage everyone to learn more about what's going on, to partner, to sponsor. And lastly, as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, we're having a terrific conference coming up that's free. It's virtual. You can sign up and join us for I think this will be the 5th year we'll have done this. So congratulations on what you're doing. That's the good news. The bad news is we have to do 10 times as much. And you have to get the other 6,000 people in Eastham to join you. And I have to get the other 6,000 people in Eastham to join us, and then we'll have a movement, and then it will start to really create some changes. So thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for listening to me tonight, and I'd be happy to take some questions at this point. What do you think? Yes, sir.
You talked about acidification of the oceans. Is that another tipping point, perhaps, when that happens?
I haven't seen the tip. If you heard the question, is the acidification a tipping point? I don't think it's as much of a dramatic tipping point as the ones I had on that slide, because it's happening gradually, but it is not happening equally across all the world's oceans. The North Pacific coast already has dramatic and serious acidification. We're not seeing it quite as much here in the Northeast, but we're beginning to. So it'll be more like it may be little mini tipping points where it will already have surpassed in certain areas, but it won't be a global tipping point. Yes.
Hi, Rich.
Hi.
Just a follow-up on that, because I was wondering when you showed that, is that more the acidification concentrated in estuaries or coves or embayments, more so than in the broader ocean? You know, like just thinking about shellfish industry and things like that.
It is. It's more intensified in the shallow waters. Okay. Yeah. And that's why the correlation with shellfish. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak a little bit about the permafrost thaw? I saw you had that up there, but.
Yes, thank you. I didn't elaborate on that slide, but part of that tipping point, when you start to have the melting of the ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, and even not on those, but like across northern Canada, the Arctic, as the ice melts, now you have the tundra, which is melting below it, and that releases not just carbon dioxide, but methane gases, which are even more deadly for climate change reasons. So that's part of the tipping. That's part of the so there's cascading impacts that happen when you get this tipping point, and you can't reverse that. Right? Yeah, you can't go back and unless we have a dramatic ice age, which we're not going to have overnight. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The melting of the permafrost, which has now already captured a lot of carbon dioxide and is keeping it there, thankfully. But once that permafrost melts, it adds to the problem. And in that case, it's not just CO2, it's methane. That's kind of a scary one as well. And you know the Arctic Ocean doesn't freeze anymore. So now we can have trade routes. People say, that's great. We can send our ships north across Canada instead of through the canal. But that's not the only impact of the melting ice. No, no. So the good news is, I get to this point and I say, wow, this is, but I have to say, and you know, we're talking existential. We're talking planetary changes that are not just scary, they're devastating. And you think about the next generations that are going to come along. You know, I've been, for a long time, as a lecturer at Wellesley College, talking about this stuff. And early on, I realized when I was describing some of the potential, some of the real, already measurable, and some of the other potential impacts that I mentioned tonight, I could see on the faces of many of the young co-eds this like fear, the scariness. And we finally we had a really open conversation about, you know, Mr. Delaney, you know, should I get married? You know, should I have children? You know, what's this world going to look like for my children? So I really, it was a lesson for me saying, wait a minute, it's not hopeless by any stretch of the imagination. The earth is not going away. We're not going to, the earth is not going to, you know, collapse. It will change significantly. And it will change in ways that we already kind of know. But the good news is we know things we can do to slow down that change and begin to prepare for how our lives will be different when we have sea levels that are up 2, 3, 4, and if that greenhouse, that Greenland ice sheet slips into the ocean and the West Arctic ice sheet comes in, 9, 10, 12, some projections are even 15 feet of sea level rise. Those are extreme. Those are not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. But if we let things go on to the next generation and they let it go to the next generation, you know, in another 20, 30, 40 years, maybe even sooner for some of these tipping points, there'll be devastation. New York City, gone, you know, underwater. Miami's already, I would, if you own property at Miami Beach, you should be selling it as fast as you can, because that's deadly. So that's why why the collaborative is out, trying to spread the word, get people knowledgeable, maybe a little alarmed, but from that, we take action. Governments have begun to take action in Paris, but they need to be a lot stronger. So we need to elect in every country, at every level, strong climate elected officials to take the strong actions they need to control industry. The good news is some of industry is getting it right. The automobile industry is getting it right. And I would be even willing to bet the fossil fuel industry, as much as they're still trying to dig their last trillion gallons of oil out of the ground, they're getting ready to invest in wind and solar because that's where the money is. So that's why you have to direct the investments toward them. And then the investors. When I was in Paris, Bill Gates and, I don't know, about 15 or 20 of his billionaire buddies created $1 trillion investment fund. Because one other thing I just want to mention, in this big global, going back up to the global picture, it's the developing world that's the problem. And the developing countries are mostly north of the equator. Just think of Europe, United States, Japan, where all the wealth is, where people live lives like we do, able to consume a lot, which produces a lot of carbon dioxide, compared to the countries that we call developing countries south of the equator. that consume far less, have far less resources, and produce far less greenhouse gases, but yet they are being victimized by the climate change. That's where a lot of the worst impacts are happening in African countries, in Southeast Asian countries, and the Caribbean islands. And so there's a whole equity issue about we caused the problem. How are we going to help the developing countries deal with their growth, which they deserve to have, without exacerbating the problem? And one of the big things in the Paris climate change is let's get our investors, private and public, to invest in and provide funds to the developing countries so they can develop an economy that's based on renewable energy, not fossil fuel energy. That's another big, big step that has to happen. It was promised in Paris. It hasn't happened sufficiently yet. So when the leaders come back in next month in Egypt to revisit all this, I know there will be a massive movement of indigenous peoples from developing countries who are already lining up to say, we demand fairness and justice. You've heard the term environmental justice. That's where it's coming from. And by the way, it happens in this country too. A lot of our poor, segments of towns and cities are where we have put most of our most polluting industries. And so that segment of our population is suffering more than some of the rest of us. So you can see on one hand, it's a fascinating topic. It cuts across us socially, politically, economically, financially, and I would say cuts across morally too. The Pope and almost every other religious leader in the world has in the last 10 years issued declarations or encyclicals or whatever they call their statements, saying it's a moral issue. We have to, as people living on this planet, the moral obligation to treat it as stewards and and be custodians of it to pass on to our next generation. So it's it's pretty interesting. And on Cape Cod, one of the first, I'm going to stop because I'm going over time, but one of the first networks that became part of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative was the Faith Community Environmental Network. And they're a very active group cutting across lots of religions that are advocating, like you are here in Eastham, for change, for action. So all those things together make me feel like, stuff is happening. Not enough, but it's beginning to happen, and we have to just push it a lot faster and a lot harder because it's urgent now. All right, any other questions? Yes?
So, thank you very much for this presentation, because it's been great. One thing, it's a little self-serving, but I would urge a little bit of discussion about salt marsh restoration.
Oh, yeah.
And how that affects climate change and reducing the amount of methane that's being produced by salt marshes that are now experiencing more fresh water than they should be, and not sequestering the carbon that they could be. So I would encourage everybody on Cape Cod to support any kind of salt marsh restoration projects that their town or other towns are proposing. They sound expensive. It's a lot of work. There's changes in hydrology, but it's really important
Yeah.
for climate change. And the second thing is, I think I read even this morning, someone from Chatham put in a letter to the editor. I can't remember now if it's Cape Cod Times or a different paper. He was a former executive at Exxon, basically saying this is all a bunch of hooey and don't believe it. So I read it thinking, I can't even believe I'm reading this, and that the paper would publish this.
I know.
So I think everybody needs to, keep the good fight and don't believe everything you read. Because boy, it was a long, and you probably read it too.
Yeah, I did.
And I was shocked by that.
But that attitude is still out there. And if the election goes a certain way,
Yeah.
November, and then the presidential election, we're gonna go right back to the dark ages. When those kinds of people will say, yep, see, don't worry about it.
And I was in a recent meeting with Congressman Bill Keating. I was about a lot of these kind of things. And one of the things he said, it was about values that we all have as residents of Massachusetts. And it resonated with me, but he said, we value being smart.
Yeah.
And I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I think this crowd shows that.
Well, and you should give the next lecture on the Herring River Restoration Project, because, and I'm glad you mentioned that, there's a whole concept called blue carbon. Sorry, so what we're talking about is, preserving healthy salt marshes, healthy eelgrass beds, all along the coastline, in mangrove swamps across the world. They make up a huge percentage of our coastal territory. And they absorb that carbon dioxide every bit as well as the Amazon rainforest. Right? So when the Herring River Project takes 1,100 acres almost of land around the Herring River that has become unproductive in many ways, and revives it, restores it as a healthy salt marsh estuarine system, those plants will once again start taking lots of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's free. I mean, in global parlance, it's called blue economy because they're talking about the blue ocean, but it's really a blue-green systems we're trying to do. And when they say blue economy, it's also because, or blue carbon, it's because it has value. So one of the interesting little side actions in Paris was some investors got together and said, if countries, developing countries, which are often under pressure to rip up their mangrove swamps so they can farm shrimp or fill it in to put hotels there or something, they said to those developing countries, for every acre of mangrove swamp that you protect and conserve in perpetuity, that has a value. We can calculate how much carbon dioxide that acre of mangrove swamp or salt marsh in the Herring River will take out of the atmosphere. That's a number. We can quantify it. We can say how valuable that is to helping slow down climate change, and we'll put a price on it, and we'll pay you money to keep it. A very clever way that investors, mostly big foundations that are trying to help us, are saying, here, we're going to help you developing countries figure out ways to protect your blue carbon economy. And we're doing that in the Herring River. So, I can talk all night, but I know you guys probably have to get home or have dinner. Roberta, should we wrap it up? Or okay, well, thank you again for your attention. Hopefully you'll join us at the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. It's free. Just join our website, get our newsletter, help Roberta's committee, take action, wherever it is, in your home, with your car, on your bicycle. Not a good bike night, but anyway. All right, thanks for being here. So, good.
I would highly recommend tuning into this Net Zero. It's a Zoom presentation in a couple of weeks. It is a great opportunity to hear from some very high-level people, federal, state, regional leaders. So many interesting things going on in climate action, and it's a morning's worth of activity. So look it up and.
And Robert, if
Yeah.
I could, we just should do a shout out to the library.
Certainly.
These guys have been great.
They have. Corey has been my friend for the last 2 months pulling these programs together, and clearly a beautiful presentation. And good night, everyone. I hope to hear from you. Again, an opportunity to connect with us through email if you'd like. Good night.